It's 40 years ago since Ford introduced the XR4i, the sporting flagship that sprinkled some welcome sugar onto the radically styled yet poorly received Sierra that was introduced a year earlier in 1982. The question is, did Ford do enough to justify that XR badge on the boot lid?
But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition.
Back in the 1970s, there was a bit of a Ford UK versus Ford of Europe battle as to how they might replace the hugely successful Cortina. And there were two different schools of thought. Ford of Britain basically wanted to replace it with a front-wheel drive, but ultimately quite conservatively styled, effectively an oversized version of the Mark III Escort. It was Ford of Europe, led by then boss Bob Lutz, that really wanted to go radical. Project Linda was canned in favour of Project Tony, and therein lies the genesis of the Sierra. Its very radical jelly-mould styling kind of betrayed the rather humdrum mechanics underneath. Rear-wheel drive, McPherson struts up front and semi-trailing arm at the back. Very orthodox mechanical base. It was always going to be a bit of a gamble as well, because although it clinicked generally very well, when they showed styling bucks to people, they didn't really associate it with Ford. So it was a bit of a gamble replacing something so ubiquitous as the Cortina with something as radical as the Sierra. There was even moves to try and keep the Cortina name, but even that was eschewed as well. For all the people did get used to that styling eventually, it was a slow burn and sales got off to a really disappointing start in 1982. So what they needed, of course, was a flagship model. And in 1983, the Belgian-built XR4i was introduced. Now the original plan was to have the 2.3 V6 engine, but it was just considered to be too gutless. They stepped up a notch and used the 2.8 V6 Cologne engine that had been installed in the Capri 2.8 injection, and that gave it just shy of 150 horsepower, give it a top speed of around 128 miles an hour. And it was really distinctive. It had all that plastic bumper mouldings to give it a slightly more dramatic look, 14-inch pepperpot alloys. It had this really distinctive three-door side graphic that was unique to the XR. All the other three-door Sierras may do with a very big piece of glass, but this has got those two separate side sections of glass, which gives it a slightly more rakish look. And of course, more distinctive than ever is that lovely biplane tailgate spoiler. And the suspension was stiffened all round, 26mm anti-roll bar at the front and a 10mm anti-roll bar at the back, vented discs up front and beefier Bilstein coil springs up front as well to give it a slightly firmer ride. So what's the XR4i actually like? Well, in truth, it's no sports car at all, but if you believe it, that was never the intention. The bosses always said they were looking more for the sporting Grand Tourer look. To some extent, that is probably more accurate. The 2.8 V6 engine just sounds glorious. It's got a richness, a lusciousness to the sound. That sort of deep burble as you accelerate. It's got plenty of power and plenty of torque. It's also really refined at low speeds as well, so it's got that maturity about it, befits its Grand Touring aspirations. The brakes are okay, it's only got drum brakes on the back, believe it or not. The 5-speed gearbox got a bit of abuse when the contemporary road testers of the day tried the car out, saying it was a little bit notchy and a little bit woolly, but I've got to say on this particular example it's not too bad. The lack of power steering shows again a lack of ambition in terms of the dynamics of the car. It lacks any sort of feel, which is a bit disappointing again on a car with some sporting pretensions. These distinctive sports seats with the Oxford upholstery, as it was known as, and the suspension, despite being stiffened and beefed up for the XR4 model, it's still quite wallowy. The ride comfort's actually not too bad. It lacks the mechanical poise and precision of a sports car, but I think ultimately that's what we need to remember, is that if it wasn't designed to be an out-and-out sports car, then it does live up to the brief that it was set out to achieve, more just a luxury sporting Grand Tourer. It's refined, it's powerful, it's smooth, effortless even. I guess my problem is that the biplane rear spoiler and the XR badging leads to a different expectation, which means that you might find yourself slightly disappointed. They were primarily gunning then for grown-up choices like a Mercedes or a BMW. Quite a brave decision in my view. I'm not sure Ford was anywhere near there in terms of brand positioning, so it feels a bit of a gamble. And ultimately, the gamble didn't pay off. The sales of those early Sierras really wasn't anything to write home about. People did have reservations about the styling. They missed the traditional three-box saloon shape of the Cortina, and it was still selling well up to the point it was replaced by the Sierra. So the XR4i sort of soldiered on for 2 years, 83 and 84. There were some spec improvements with September 1984 cars. Power steering became standard, although there were still no anti-lock brakes on offer. which I find bewildering for a 150 horsepower V6 engine. Come 1985, Ford had to introduce the Sierra XR4x4. With its all-wheel drive train, the XR4 had something a little bit more to shout about. And of course that ultimately segued beautifully into the Cosworth versions. By the time the Sierra did get to its Series 2 facelift in 86, which also included the Sapphire car, sales had started to pick up. So you could argue that the Sierra did come on stream quite nicely towards the end, but there's no doubt about it, that radical styling set Ford back massively. So to go back to my question at the top of the video, does it deserve to have that XR badge on the boot lid? I'm not sure it does, if I'm honest. When I think of an XR, I think of the scrappy-do XR2 or the slightly rough and ready XR3. I don't think of the XR4, which feels leaden by comparison, sedate even. Going around these corners here, it leans, and I'm not pushing it. But here's the thing, if we hadn't have got the XR4 and XR4x4, we may never have seen the iconic Cosworth models that were to follow. So I suppose Ford just had to go on a bit of a journey with the Sierra. It learnt the hard way that radical styling doesn't always endear yourself to your fan base, certainly not straight away, but through a bit of persistence and some halo models like the XR4, the Sierra did ultimately turn out to be a huge success for the brand, and of course it lasted for well over 10 years. I think the trouble is Ford didn't really throw the might of their special vehicle operations behind the XR4, so effectively it's just a standard car with a few bells and whistles. Dynamically it doesn't live up to that XR4 badge on the boot lid. So radically styled, much maligned, the Sierra is a fascinating point in Ford's history, and I still love it because of that.
This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.